Okay, everybody. This is part two of our lecture for week 11, and I'm just going to go ahead and start with this week's question. I would like you to describe to me from the readings what, in your words, is the difference between a migrant and a settler colonizer. A settler and a migrant have a different sort of historical trajectory, and I'd like you to explain that in your own words. But then I'd also like you to give me an example from our contemporary politics or geopolitics, global geopolitics, of what a settler is and what a migrant is, and maybe even places where these folks are interacting today. So, again, one paragraph, please send that to my email, and I look forward to reading them. As I mentioned, I'm going to pick up from the lecture in part one, talking about this idea of population production. In my opinion, population production is something that we already have, or the concept of population production is something we already have in our imagination. For anybody who studies or is just interested in sci-fi, you can see that the idea of colonizing other planets, or the idea of traveling to other planets and repopulating those planets, is really a spin-off from our own settler colonial epistemologies, where we are obsessed with the idea of continuing the legacy of our own culture. Interestingly enough, for settlers, though, as Veracini points out, this is not about a specific sort of like nationalist or imperial culture, but this is really about a sovereign and individualistic kind of culture. So as Veracini uses these sort of like intricate graphs, I'll sort of break it down as simply as I can to say that for Veracini, the settler colonist citizen becomes this sort of like imaginary figure. It's almost like a mythical self-made figure where they have all of the benefits of the sort of like technologies and languages and cultural heritage of Northwestern Europeans, but they must do this act of rejecting all of those as part of their story, which brought them to this quote-unquote new world in the first place. This idea of rejection of the imperial is part of the population production process, because there requires this very specific rejection of colonial nationalism or centralized governments in a trade-off for what the settlers eventually manifest as these sort of like localized bands of settler governments, which eventually become a republic. Now, the reason why the settler is obsessed with rejecting the colonial other is because it must maintain this sort of like population control over immigrants. And in order to do so, it must claim that all those who are previously colonial or European are not native to the new state. With the case of indigenous peoples, controlling the populations means that there are some native peoples who might eventually be transferred into the settlement through assimilation or through intermarriage. But for the most part, the indigenous peoples who are not willing to buy into the settler lifestyle are subsumed into an abject category of citizenship. This is true of also the exogenous, the migrant or non-native groups who come from other countries that for some will get elevated into the settler class, and for others will also be subsumed into this sort of like abject class. To me, this is really an important understanding of settler colonialism, because it's not necessarily about what Homi Bhabha would call a constant state of the colonizer and the colonized, this sort of like binary of classes. What it does is it presents us with this complex idea of how the settler citizenship control mechanism works. It is constantly placing those who the settler identifies with, typically culturally Northwestern European white phenotypes, in elevated statuses in societies. Those who perform a particular sort of like sovereignty, which is rooted in, and we'll talk about this in chapter 2, but is rooted in sort of this like willingness to do the violences of settler colonialism, and they are also elevated. And then of course those who won't ever fit in get subsumed into a second class of citizenry. Unlike many theorists, though, who say that the ultimate goal of settler colonialism is to eradicate or completely eliminate natives and abject other exogenous groups like migrants from Africa and Latin America, the goal is actually to keep these groups in cycles of violence and exploitation to prop up the settler economy. One of the things that we see in Verasini's next chapter is how all of these projects of creating the second-class citizenry and then producing the settler citizen as central to the state are all in the project of essentially creating a settler economy that self-produces. And we'll talk more about that next week. So please go to the beginning of this video for your weekly question. And if you have any questions, comments, otherwise about chapter 1, I'd be happy to talk about them or email back and forth. Be well.